we are looking this week at, the chapter is called None of These Diseases. And I base this on Exodus 15:26, where it talks about, and let me just quote this because this is really the premise of the entire chapter. It says, if you will diligently listen to the voice of YHWH your God, and will do that which is right in his sight, and will listen to his commandments, and keep his statutes, I will put none of these diseases on you that I have brought upon the Egyptians, for I am YHWH who heals you. So the implication there is at least twofold. It is, number one, that God either intentionally put diseases on the Egyptians, or that their actions just violated his law, so there were natural consequences whereby there were diseases. And also the idea that if we listen to God's statutes, we listen to his way of life, that it is naturally healing to us, and that there is a way that is a blessing in and of itself. So, and let me just welcome the newcomers. Great to see you, Liz, and Jeff, Sylvia, Sue, Sylvestus. I'm so glad to see all of y'all. It's great to have y'all with us on Erev Shabbat. And please, again, as we go along, if okay, Betty, great to have you with us. You know, as we go along, if you have any questions, please just jump right in, and we'll tackle those as we come to it. So tonight, you know, one of the things that I wrote on page 191, this was really at the beginning of chapter 6, is that theology determines political systems. And we really find this, and I think today this is no more apparent than in Islam, where you have very warring and competing factions of Islam, you know, whether it's Shiite or Sunni. They have different interpretations of their faith, and they are very zealous for it, to the point of civil strife and, of course, of bloodshed. You know, that again determines their political system. They want to live under Sharia law. When you look at Sharia law, it's good for them, but it's not really that good for a lot of other people. For instance, one of the things that they were talking about in Israel is that if a Muslim comes in and settles anywhere on the land, if they are there for 3 years, then the land is theirs. They've settled it. It's kind of like, you know, going out and staking your claim. But if a Jew were to do the same thing, they would have no rights. They would have no legal claim to the land. So there's definitely a double standard within Sharia. A distinction between Sharia and the Torah is that YHWH tells us that the same law is for the Israeli, the Izrek, the homeborn citizen, as for the foreigner. So there is no distinction. There is not that discrimination in Torah that you find in competing law code systems. And we're going to get into this as we get into the latter part of chapter 6 and chapter 7. But again, theology does determine your political system. You look at our Judeo-Christian heritage, that has really come out of a lot of the bloodshed that we've had in our own history, whether it be with the Crusades, whether it be with the Inquisitions. We've really learned from our history, and we've now applied our faith in different ways. But our founding fathers, we can be very grateful here in America, saw the Torah as a political document. They saw it establishing at Sinai a way of life that would benefit humanity and establish justice upon the land, which, believe it or not, is the claim of Torah. You know, if we are righteous, if we follow this, it says, no nation on earth will excel you in liberty and freedom than you. That's Deuteronomy 4:6-8. You know, it's this idea that you have righteous law codes, not laws of men, made by men, but a divine code that benefits your entire society and could be extrapolated and benefit the entire world if it's adhered to. So with this, we find anciently that there were ancient ideals, political and religious ideals, that separated the nations. For instance, the Greek, for them, there was really, you know, action was separated from sin. So if you did something, It was all luck and chance. There was the fact that perhaps you smoked and you had cancer. And this is a very modern context. I'm just doing this for comparative understanding. You know, today, modernly, we know that if you smoke, you are something like 90% more likely to develop lung cancer. For the ancient Greeks, they would have saw no correlation whatsoever. Everything is just chance and circumstance, and there's just luck and the luck of the draw in Greek theology. In Egyptian theology, it was always blame it on the gods. God made me do it. The idea that the gods had influenced you to do something or not to do something. In Israel, in contrast, there was always this idea of personal accountability. You didn't blame it on God. You didn't blame it on your fellow man. Rather, you owned up to it. Now, I want to issue a disclaimer as we look through some of the ideas of disease. So when we start out, we're going to look at the relationship between sin and disease. And it may sound as if there is always a one-for-one correspondence, and that is the Tanakh view. Please hang with me till the end of this as we look complete chapter 6, because that is not the total view. It's a partial view, but it could be very distorted and very misused if a full and complete understanding is not there. So hang with me. We do find that in ancient Israel, there's a direct correspondence between violating the Torah and the idea of disease. And we're going to see some research that supports this as we go on. In the ancient Near East, this would be whether we look at Greece, or we look at Mesopotamia or Egypt, to some degree, I'm going to exclude Greece because Greece really did not have this this worldview, but Mesopotamia and Egypt did. And that was that sin brought disease. And in those nations, if you pacified the gods, you often found healing. Now, here's the tricky part, because sin was never really defined. It was never codified where you knew, if, say, you coveted, or say stealing, is a sin. Those types of things were never actually classified in a law code that was handed down generations to generations. It just didn't exist. So the concept of sin was very arbitrary. You always had to seek to the gods to see if you offended them, to see what it was that you did. You never had really any assurance or nothing, that you could just maybe get out a book and refer to it and say, hey, was this an issue? Did I violate something? So that is very much a distinction. In Torah, we find that the God of Israel is always separating between good and evil, and that his Torah embraces natural law. So that, whereas in ancient Near Eastern theology, you had, the will of the gods that you had to pacify. And in later Christianity, this, we're talking 1,500 years later, you have this idea that developed, and this is a modern idea within Christianity. It is not, say, the idea within Christianity, the idea of God that was embraced 150 years ago or by America's founding fathers. And the more modern view of God is that he is simply a God that does good, and that all evil comes from the enemy, the devil, or Satan. That is not a view that you find historically always within Christianity, and it is definitely not a view that you find within the Tanakh. In the Tanakh, you find that YHWH, the God that gives Moses the law, the God that speaks and prophesies of Cyrus in Isaiah 45, you find that the God of the Tanakh does good and he does evil, but he does it righteously. So there's a distinction there. He never does wickedness, but he does what the Hebrew calls raw, which is evil. And in the Hebrew concept, evil can be anything that is misfortunate. So if you get a cold, well, that can be evil. You stub your toe, that could be evil. It doesn't mean that God causes all those things. It's just that simply the definition of raw or evil in the Tanakh is anything misfortunate or bad. It does not mean that it is devious in any way, the way that the term wickedness would indicate. So in Torah, we find this idea that God has given to us a natural law. And if we follow it, it will naturally lead to blessings. If we depart from it, it will lead to curses and to consequences. So for me in my journey, because when I first began my research, I had to know, I had to prove it to myself. Is there some correlation between the precepts and the statutes of Torah and what we know about modern disease? Or is it all hocus pocus, wives' tales, and just a lot of superstition? You know, when you look at the diseases of Egypt, and you read, say, the Ebris Papyrus, or you read the Hearst Papyrus, or some of the other Egyptian documents, and how they, the prescriptions that they have for dealing with disease, some of them are actually do have a foundation. As a matter of fact, about 6 months ago, there was an article that talked about how this one eye salve, cooking it in a was it a bronze pot? No, it was a copper pot, actually produced a antibacterial type of substance that was very beneficial and actually did indeed cure eye diseases. At the same time, for that one good remedy, you have about 1,000 other remedies that probably cause disease and spread disease. So in Egypt, there really is no comparison, because probably there's a 90% failure rate within Egyptian prescriptions. For instance, one of them was take the bile of a faithful wife, mix it with you know, the goose of a grease, and apply it. Well, we know modernly that bile contains such bacteria and parasites, especially back then, without modern cleanliness that we have today. It really would have been an issue, and people would have become very sick in many cases. So for me, and in my journey and in my study, I had to see if the Torah met certain criteria. Was it good for humanity? Did, you know, the claim in Exodus 15:26 is that if you follow this law, I will heal your diseases. So I had to test and see if that is true. So here is some of what I discovered. The first question that I had to ask, when YHWH states that he put diseases on Egypt, my first question, being the inquiring mind that I am, is what diseases did he put on Egypt? So we find that there were cardiovascular diseases, and most of this information is gained from examination of Egyptian mummies. In recent years, I would say over the last 30 years, scientists and archaeologists have taken Egyptian mummies, they've run them through CAT scans, they have extracted DNA where there is tissue and where it permits. They've been able to do samples on skin and other parts of the cadaver, and sometimes even the organ jars that are often put in the tomb with the mummy. They're able to study all of these, and by studying all of these samples, their 8 doctors and physicians are able to make certain judgments and evaluations of the health and the condition of these pharaohs during their life. Now remember, Pharaoh would have had the best health care. He would have been more taken care of and better preserved than the rest of society. So if we see these diseases within the upper echelon, we could possibly say that even within the lower classes, these diseases would be even more prevalent, because they would not have access to whatever remedies were available. Of course, given the remedies, they may have enjoyed better life, since they weren't exposed to feces on as a cure for some of their ailments. Kind of disgusting. So we find Egyptian mummies show heart disease, cardiovascular diseases, plague, such as Black Death, leprosy, parasites, arthritis, osteomyelitis. Basically, all of the diseases that we deal with today are exhibited in Egyptian cadavers. There is also evidence, and I believe I saw a recent article, I've got to go back and find it, where they have very recently also discovered cancer. And that's always been debated because one of the diseases that's discussed in the Everest Medical Papyrus is a condition that sounds very much like cancer, but scholars don't recognize it as cancer simply because they have not yet medically confirmed it through a medical diagnosis. So that's always something that's just put out there as a possibility. Well, more recently, I believe it was in this past year, they have finally found a positive identification of cancer in a mummy cadaver. So now there's more credence to the fact that cancer was also one of the diseases with which Egyptians struggled. So again, it's almost as if Exodus 15:26, as though Yahweh is almost testing us to say, will you obey or will you not? But it's also as though it's a natural law. If you obey it, these blessings will naturally come to you. If you disobey, there's natural consequences. So what are the consequences? According to Torah, it's going to be poor health. So, and again, let me issue another disclaimer, because as we go through this, in the beginning, you may see like a one-per-one correspondence. So if you or a loved one have ever struggled with cancer, if you've ever struggled with heart disease and you think, oh my goodness, it's because I've sinned, just hold on. There's actually some more factors in this. So let's not rush to any conclusions with this. So let's look at some of the preventative medicines and preventative prescriptions, because truly Yahweh recognizes that once you contract a disease, it is very difficult for you to ever heal from it, for you to overcome it. We have a lot of pharmaceuticals, a lot of options to us modernly that give us a much better rate of survival, a much better rate of healing in our modern age that they would not have had 150, 200 years ago or 1,000 years ago. So I'm very grateful for this, but at the same time, you know, a lot of times, you know, cancer is not always able to be cured. So what we find in Torah is that prevention is the best medicine. And everything that YHWH tells us to do is preventative medicine. So let's first look at circumcision. I was just really astounded that going through the research, finding that circumcision not only helps reduce sexually transmitted diseases, but it was almost more beneficial for the woman than for the man. And again, this comes back to the fact that sometimes if you sin, it doesn't always affect you. Sometimes that sin may never affect you, but it affects somebody else. And in this case, if you're not circumcised, it will affect your partner. Circumcision, well, let me tell you first the most notorious bacteria. There are others, but the most notorious bacteria that is associated with the foreskin and not circumcising is called Smyrna bacillus. So what happens is the bacteria is lodged under the foreskin, and it creates this virulent environment. And this infection during intercourse is then deposited in the cervix of the woman. And infection, and especially recurrent infections, eventually lead to diseases such as cervical cancer. So this constant contact, a constant exposure, always increases risks. So I found it absolutely fascinating that there was a 58% reduction in cervical cancer among women if their partners were circumcised. So I would say, you know, in the modern political arena, that circumcision is, I would say, a if you're going to claim something along feminism or women's rights, it would definitely be the right to a partner that is circumcised, because your health and your welfare really depends on it. You also find, one of the studies that I came across was the study of circumcision in 5 countries and on 3 continents. There was a 20% rate of HPV, which is the human papillomavirus, 20% rate in non-circumcised people, and only 6% in circumcised. So that's a drastic difference. But even more than that, the researchers found that there was an 8-fold reduction for the risk of HIV. Now, HPV is usually seen as the first step in a sexually transmitted disease that eventually can progress into HIV. But this practicing circumcision really doesn't care about your religion. It's very interesting, because all of these tests, all of these results, it really didn't matter what your ethnicity was. It didn't, it doesn't matter your religion. Doesn't matter if you believe in Muhammad. Doesn't matter if you believe in Jesus. Doesn't matter if you believe in YHWH. If you practice circumcision, you are going to receive the benefits of that act, because the blessing is in the physically doing of the law, whereby you both reduce the risk of your partner and yourself. And if you're in a monogamous relationship, you have no risk, because you're not introducing other viruses, other bacteria to that structure and to the things that both of you are exposed to. Now, I'm going to pause for just a minute here. We're going to get back into some research among Jewish in just a moment. I'm going to catch some of these comments. Okay, so Whitey Boy states Deuteronomy 32:9, see that I am he, right, quoting from Isaiah 45. And then Stephen states, the reason it became standard in America is that during World War I, Jews in the trenches weren't getting the diseases others did when they couldn't bathe for weeks on end. They just left out the 8-day part, so it was neat to do and right away for the sons. Right. Now, I was not aware of that. Thank you for sharing that, because I was not aware of the World War I connection. And you know what? If you know of any articles on that, you can share it. I would be grateful. If not, I will actually go research that on my own, because now you've sparked my interest. So speaking of Jews not contracting the diseases that other people, Westerners, often contract, as early as 1918, and this was one of the very first studies that was found at Mount Sinai Hospital, and this was a predominantly Jewish hospital, that the women there among the Orthodox community, and it's assumed that they were Torah observant, they were almost 100% free of cervical cancers. They just didn't get them. In 1954, another study done, some 30 years later, the study contrasted both Jewish, of course, women with their counterparts, the non-Jewish women. And they found that non-Jewish women were 8.5 times more likely to contract cervical cancer. This is a basic women's right issue with this. Women's health care. What do you see in the social media today regarding, the rights of women and access to health care, access to, a better future? Well, the better future is really established right here in Torah with, Women's Rights 101. And where does it begin? It really begins not necessarily with her, but it begins with her partner. So I find that a very kind of oxymoron in a modern political discussion. You also find that, again, it doesn't matter, these results among Jewish women are also representative among Islamic women. They usually have about the same rate of reduction in cervical cancers because their male counterparts are also circumcised. So you simply don't have those diseases that you are exposed to, as you do in Western society that does not circumcise. Again, the important thing to remember is that at birth, circumcision should be done on the 8th day. That is for at least 2 reasons. Number one, it takes 7 days of breastfeeding. Excuse me, my nose is itching here. It takes 7 days of breastfeeding for the infant to build up enough vitamin K in their bloodstream to allow for proper clotting, number one. Number two, there is a protein called prothrombin that also helps in the clotting process. On the 3rd day of life, that protein is only at 30%, but at day 8, it's at 100%. So we find a correlation here, not only between the vitamin K, but also between the prothrombin. That day 8 is actually the best day to circumcise a child, and that is the exact day that the Creator gives to us. So to say that there is no correspondence, you know, when I saw this during my research, I was just like, wow, you know, this is amazing. That because, you know, whether it's Christianity or Judaism, I've heard the arguments on both sides that Torah is not a scientific document. It's a religious document, and there's no correlation with anything scientific. It's just kind of this arbitrary thing that God says do, and you do it because He's God. Well, you do it because He's God, but there is a scientific reason. And whether we're looking at creation and cosmology, whether we are looking at the circumcision or kashrut, which we'll look at in a moment, in every single case, we find that there is scientific reasons and validity that are for our benefit and for our good. So Stephen writes, there wasn't such a dichotomy when it was written. Right. You know, we actually do find that in ancient Egypt, probably, I believe the dating is right around 2000 BCE, that ancient Egyptians at one time did participate in circumcision. And then it appears to have fallen out of popularity as you go on through the later, and especially as you get into the New Kingdom period. They did not participate it as they did in the Old Kingdom era. So, you know, the correlation between disease there, we don't know. They recently found, because the oldest case of syphilis was recently found at Pompeii about 3 years ago. And then I believe, and don't quote me on this because I'm going off of memory and I could be wrong on this, but I believe they also recently found syphilis at an Egyptian work camp within the last couple years, just through examining some of the bacterium that was present there. Now, what's also interesting, Johns Hopkins, about 3 years ago, came out with a very interesting study. And they said that the 20-year decline, so we're going to be saying from about this would have been about 1990 to about 2010. So the 20-year decline in circumcision has cost society $2 billion in healthcare expenditures. Now, that's pretty incredible. And on top of healthcare expenditures, you also have the loss of life. You have the loss of the person's ability to work. You have pain and suffering that you can't put a monetary value on that. But those are still the consequences that arise from not following the simple procedure. You know, I tell this story. I have a friend who is an atheist, and she did not circumcise her sons. And when her oldest son was about 3 years old, he indeed did get a bacterial infection. He was hospitalized, and he almost lost his appendage. He was in the hospital quite a few days. And the doctor told her the number one reason is because you did not circumcise. So he did get circumcised at the age of 3. And it really made her a believer. You know, the mantra that you hear among feminists is that it's genital mutilation. And that couldn't be far further from the truth. It's a necessary procedure to preserve the life of that child as well as his future partner. So you're really thinking long term, and you're thinking down the road. And Stevens says that Abraham lived at exactly the same time as Egypt was performing the circumcisions during the Old Kingdom. And that's very true. Great point, Stephen. And he also states prevention partners need to start earlier in life. Absolutely. Yeah. You know, there's a campaign slogan for you: prevention from birth. So anyway, so that I found was very, very interesting. So with circumcision, we do find a direct correlation between the Torah, natural law, and prevention of disease. And we find that, again, when it is followed, you don't get the sexually transmitted diseases, especially among monogamous partners, that you do if the circumcision is not followed. And beyond sexually transmitted diseases, of course, there are cancers. So now we're going to move to kashrut, which is another healthcare prescription given in Torah. And one of the first things that we find is the prohibition against both swine, which is pig, and that could be pork. Let's see. I'm trying to remember all the names since I'm not real familiar with it, since I don't eat it. Pork, pepperoni, ham. All of those are pig sources. They're all derived from swine. So, you know, I've heard the mantra lately in more modern context, because people really, when they see these parallels between science and they see cogency between modern medical studies and Torah, they become very uncomfortable with it. So then they start justifying the eating of pork and saying, well, it's okay for us. And the reason they say it's okay is because we know scientifically that pork contains more toxins and more parasites than any other meat that is out there to date, especially any meat that's readily eaten by other people. And yet people will say, well, it's okay for us to eat it modernly because we have the ability to cook it at high temperatures. And they couldn't cook it at high consistent temperatures way back then. Well, first of all, that's not true. They had ovens in which they cook their food, and they could reach very high temperatures. You look at the bricks that their kilns made. You look at the ovens, you know, as a reenactor that goes out and lives, that has lived off the land, kind of more or less. We've built campfires where you make an oven on the side of the campfire, and it's very easy to get a very high consistent heat. So first of all, that argument fails. The second thing is that there are a lot of bacterium, a lot of parasites, as well as a lot of different viruses that are harbored within the meat of the pig that are not even killed at high temperatures. So again, that argument really fails. And I think that a lot, and this has not been very well researched, and probably because if you're familiar with the lobbying associations with the raising of pork, you'll understand why there hasn't been a lot of research. Most of your college campuses receive their funding from big manufacturers, whether it's Monsanto or AT&T, Sprint. You know, every college campus, if you're going to study a particular venue, you have a donor that is supporting you. And if you come across research that contradicts what your donor is doing, it's not going to be that popular. So that is my opinion as to why you don't see more studies along these lines. With the prohibition on swine, you find that they do harbor more parasites. You also find that, and this was something that I learned in my study because I had no idea, that pigs are the #1 culprits for meningitis. So every time you see a meningitis outbreak, a lot of that is simply because people are eating swine. And whether it's cooked or not cooked really doesn't matter, because those bacterium are still there. Yeah, Stephen says, like shellfish, pigs do not sweat, so the impurities can never be removed from the meat. Betty says, I have read that swine are not capable of being properly bled, something about the tissue holding the blood. Well, and that's true, and that's very fascinating. I haven't read that one, Liz, or I mean Betty. But I do know that pigs have a digestive system that's very similar to humans, and they're very acidic. So what we know about a lot of acidic foods is that it's unhealthy and very toxic and causes cancer. So swine are one of the very top prohibitions in Torah, and we do see a correlation between good health and that prohibition. We see preventative measures because if you don't eat it, you're not going to be exposed to meningitis. You're not going to be exposed to all of the parasites like trichinella. You're not going to be exposed to the bacterium that meat harbors. The other prohibition is on shellfish and certain types of fish that do not have both skins and scales. So in other words, to eat fish, you had to have both skins and scales in order for it to be considered clean. And that really is the classification, clean and unclean, tahor, the idea that something is either ritually clean or ritually unclean. But I think I would expand that just from what I have learned in this study to include the idea of healthy and unhealthy. Either a meat is healthy for you to eat or it is unhealthy for you to eat. And that seems to be the overall philosophy or concept that Torah is trying to teach us, is to be discriminating, to study and to choose wisely those things that we're going to invest in our bodies. Stephen says, catfish and shellfish clean up the water, but keep all the stuff inside them. Exactly. And what we find, whether it's shellfish or swine or catfish, what the types of fish that are prohibited are consistently your vacuum cleaners of their breed. They are the, I call them in the book, I say they're the feces eaters of their breed. And that's really what they do. They go around all day eating, poop. And that they process that, but then I don't know how many of you guys have actually seen an animal that has been slaughtered, and a lot of times what they have eaten is still in their gut, it's still in their system, and sometimes if it's not slaughtered properly, it will expand and be exposed to all the meat, and everything becomes tainted. The same thing with unclean animals, whereas in say cows, it's processed and it leaves their system. It never really does with the shellfish and the catfish, and then you're exposed to not food that they're eating like grass or herbs on the ground. You're exposed to all the poop they've been eating. So it's really a very unclean and unsanitary type of environment. The other thing that we find in Torah, the other prohibition comes from Deuteronomy 14:21, and that is don't eat roadkill. Don't eat an animal that dies of itself. Today, modernly, it's like, do we really even have to say that to someone? But I will say that having lived in some of the more redneck parts of the country and being exposed to what people actually eat, some people just don't have common sense. They think if there's a dead animal, that's free food. I don't have to pay for it, so I'm going to go eat it. And I am actually shocked because I actually have heard people express that opinion. And so God tells us not to do that. Because if an animal has died of itself, he's going to have disease. You don't just die. Even if it's of natural causes, it's still not a healthy meat or a product to eat that type of meat. Oh, Stephen makes a very funny comment. He says regarding the intestines and the inner workings of the catfish or any of these other species that eat poop. He's saying, "Oh, but it's poop digested." So that's really cute. Stephen also states, someone found a solution for roadkill and animal rights. They're now getting furs from roadkill instead. Was on NPR last week. That's very fascinating. That's a good point. And a great way for conservation as well. So that's interesting. Thanks for sharing that. You also find that in addition to the idea of certain meats being unclean for humans, that human bodily fluids are also considered unclean. So that if you ever come in contact with a bodily substance, whether it be saliva or excretions, whether it's semen or vaginally, or say even a lesion from your skin, any type of bodily excretion is considered unclean, and the instruction is to wash and be unclean until evening. And when you look at these cleanliness standards, I think that we've been too tongue-in-cheek with the idea that cleanliness is next to godliness, because everything in Torah teaches you to wash, to wait a while, and be clean. And that is the standard, get right with God kind of procedure, especially if you're going to the temple. This was the procedure you had to follow. And by following it, it really cut down on the diseases that ancient Israel was exposed to. Modern Jews continue this type with ritual washings of the hands that they do, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's at least 3 times a day. So by doing this, it simply cut down on the transmission of bacteria and made Israelite society a whole lot healthier. So again, there's a direct correspondence between the instructions in Torah and what we see in medical science today. The other thing that science has revealed is that in every case, the blood and the fat is more toxic than the meat. So that, what the blood contains more toxicity, more parasite, and is more parasitic than the actual flesh. David Mock, this was in 1953, did a study on the toxicity of meats. In every single case, your most toxic were your unclean animals, and your least toxic were your clean animals. So there's another just fly in your face, oh my goodness, there's a correlation. So it becomes very hard to deny the validity of at least the medical preventative prescriptions in the Tanakh when you see case after case being confirmed. You also find that blood, again, contains more toxins. It contains more parasites that can be easily transmitted. You also find that fat, of course, stores the excess. So if you are unhealthy in any way, that disease, pesticides, whatever it is going to be more likely to lodge in the fat than it will be in the muscle tissue itself or the flesh. So this leads to 2 modern man-made diseases, and that would be mad cow and anthrax. And a lot of times you'll hear people say, well, look at mad cow. Those are vegetarian You know, they're not carnivores, and they're not you know, feces eaters, but yet you see mad cow or even anthrax. How do you explain that? Well, when you look at how science tells us that mad cow originated, it really occurred due to species cannibalism, where cows were given meat and bone meal, which included ground up cows, as part of their feed, and that led to the I think it's called human bovine disease, but the mad cow disease. Anthrax, same thing, and we really haven't seen anthrax, I believe, in at least 100 years, but it was a deathly, I mean, just horrid disease back in the 1800s. And again, how did anthrax start? Well, it started, I believe it was a poor farmer in Ireland who gave a dead sheep as feed to the other sheep of his herd, and that started the virus. And many viruses, and this is the other important thing, viruses that occur within a pig population, you know, where especially where there's a large swine to human contact. Swine are so close in many ways genetically to humans that diseases cross over very quickly, so that your swine flu or your influenza has historically started among animals and then been transmitted to humans. So that's why you really want to cut down on that exposure and that risk. As a matter of fact, Torah is very clear that you don't touch the corpse of a dead animal. And he says, don't even touch a swine's flesh, because they naturally carry the antibodies, so that they may not actually be infected with the disease, but they're still going to carry the retrovirus within them, even, and they may lie dormant, but yet you could still be exposed and you can still contract it and pass that on to others. The other thing that we see is that with dealing with disease. So say you contract a skin condition, or maybe you have a cold or a cough, maybe it's pneumonia. It really didn't matter what it was in Torah. The first step that you did is you quarantined. You know, you either had a period of 7 days, a period of 14 days. It's assumed that Israel's priests, because the priests were the ones doing the diagnosis, the initial consultation, it's assumed that they would have had enough exposures to different diseases that they could have recognized a particular manifestation and be able to diagnose it pretty accurately, and then prescribe a set amount of quarantine time to see if it heals or if it gets worse. Unlike other ancient nations, and I'm going to grab a glass of water here. Unlike other ancient nations, the Torah does not risk community exposure. And so in Greece, when you had leprosy, or you had pneumonia, or cancer, heart disease, it really didn't matter what it was. If you were exhibiting symptoms, in Greece, you would go to basically an ancient hospital. It was a temple complex where you went for healing. And while you were there, you exposed all these other people with compromised immunities. These people may have stayed there for a few weeks if they lived, and then they would go back to their communities and take those diseases, those viruses, back to their home communities and expose a whole new population. So this really kept the disease alive and living and multiplying within society. In Israel's society, you really were insular in that you quarantined yourself for either 7 days or 14 days. You know, there's other diseases that take 21 days to manifest. I believe Ebola is something like 5 to 6 weeks before you exhibit symptoms. So, you know, you would respond in kind to what you know about incubation periods. I do not see the 7 and 14 days being hard and fast, something that is unmovable. And for this reason, because, and let me see if I can find the text here. Because the Torah teaches that the entire law of what is called leprosy, and let me just point out that biblical leprosy is not the same thing as modern leprosy, which is Hansen's disease. The biblical term for leprosy really denoted a large gamut of skin conditions. It could include leprosy, but it certainly was not limited to it. We find that, and let me just share with you the Levitical formula, which this is modern triage. This is the basic thing that doctors and nurses do every day, whether they're at the hospital or you're on the field in a mission field or in another country. This is the number one thing that you do when you are examining a patient. So this was the evaluation formula. Identify the patient's symptoms, and this is Leviticus 13, verses 1 through 4. Isolate the patient if conditions warrant, Leviticus 13:4. You reevaluate, Leviticus 13:5, and either re-quarantine if needed or re-diagnose with a bill of good health or chronic symptoms. You keep doing this basically until the symptoms go away or unless the patient is diagnosed as either contagious or something that is a threat to the community. But overall, you find that the reason that the entire protocol for leprosy is given is so that the Levites can distinguish when something is clean and then when something is unclean. So the idea there is that they're going to take this procedure for leprosy. Stephen thinks that it might be psoriasis, which is a possible diagnosis as well. You're going to take this protocol and you're going to apply it not just to leprosy, but you are going to apply it to a whole gamut of diseases that arise within your community, especially as your nation, or if and when your nation declines from the law, because the further you decline from the law, the more diseases you're going to have, the more rate incidence of cancer and viruses, very cold viruses, RSV, lung viruses. You're going to have more of those rates. And if you'll remember Deuteronomy 28, I think it's right around 60, maybe it's 54. One of the curses of the law is that God will, hold on, let me see, my phone's ringing here. God will not only put the diseases of Egypt upon you, but beyond that he will send diseases of sore and of long continuance. So that is something that we also have to consider as a consequence from departing from this law. Now, as I mentioned before, there's this tendency to always see a one-per-one correspondence between sin and disease. And that is not always the case. Sometimes, like circumcision, you could have a woman, a beautifully a Torah observant woman, but if her partner is not circumcised, she could end up with cervical cancer.
Memory is full. Enter.
Not sure what happened there. You can also have a situation where a company is dumping toxic waste nearby and you don't know it. Maybe it's seeping into your groundwater. Maybe you live next to fracking and some of the chemicals that are there and it's in your groundwater and you don't know. Or maybe you do know and there's nothing you can do about it. Maybe your access to food is not organic, fresh out of nature, and there's pesticides. There's a linkage between pesticides and cancers. So just because some of us become sick does not always mean that it is our sins. Sometimes it's the sins of the community, and either because our particular systems are weak or more vulnerable, for whatever reasons, we contract them. But it's not always because it's something that you or I did that's wrong, but it is more likely something that our community or our nation has done. So just keep that in mind, and don't take it, you know, all on yourself. So I would encourage that. So we did end today at page 204. Next week, we are going to go from 204 to 2, I think it's 13, to 216. So 204 to 216. So that's not very many pages, about 12 pages. And if you guys have any questions or comments, please feel free to add them. And I'm going to continue. If you guys want to stay on, I'm going to share just a little bit of my trip to Israel the last 2 weeks. We had such a phenomenal time. I really encourage, if you guys have ever thought about a tour to the Holy Land, do consider going with Jono and the Tanakh tour. Oh, we are still in chapter 6, Stephen. So we're still in chapter 6. So it is the part 2 that begins with, is the law morally sound, and its family function. And we'll finish up the last half of chapter 6. So, okay, perfect. So let me share with you. Let me see if I have my paper with me. I might just have to go off of memory here. Okay, I'm going to try to go off of memory here. So we flew out of here on Thursday. And the plan was for us to meet up with Ross Nichols and his son Ty, and we would be on the same flight from Newark to Tel Aviv. Well, one of our planes was delayed, and we missed that flight by something like 15 minutes as far as their cutoff date for allowing our luggage to go on the aircraft. And we had a 7-hour delay. Let me tell you, we were so exhausted when we got to Tel Aviv. We just couldn't see straight. All the hotels that we stayed with the Tanakh tour were first class, first rate, like 4- and 5-star hotels, beautiful, and incredible food. So Israeli food, you have lots of tomatoes and cucumbers and hummus and baba ganoush and all sorts of condiments. You, for breakfast, you have lots of eggs and this incredible dish that's called shatsuka. Oh, candy. We did not make it to Tamar. Tamar closed 2 weeks before we got there, so we did not make it. I'm hoping we can next time. So shakshuka is basically a kind of a spaghetti sauce with meat in it dish, and sometimes it has, I guess they use a sort of a tofu, since they don't mix meat and dairy, but some sort of a meaty tofu type dish with tomatoes, and then you either have a fried or boiled egg that's on top of that. So that is a very good dish that I learned about. I plan to make it for my family. But you have low yogurts, you have lots of pastries, typical kind of American type fried pastries. But anyways, so we came into Tel Aviv. Our very first day out was a Tuesday, and we went up to Mount Carmel, and it was a beautiful day. It was windy at first, and then it kind of settled down a little bit, but we got to, it was a little hazy. And if you guys will look, I am posting on both Facebook as well as another YouTube channel that I titled Tanakh Tour 2015. You can check that out as well. I have pictures from that. And you can really, you see Mount Tabor from Mount Carmel. You really can see almost all the way to Jerusalem from Mount Carmel. It's just amazing. Just a beautiful, beautiful spot. While we were there, Tovia Singer, who was one of the tour guides on the trip, he's basically a walking encyclopedia. If you thought that based on his the interviews that he does, he really is. So it's not just on camera. But he gave a little talk there at Mount Carmel, which was very nice. Then from there we left and we went to Megiddo, and that was an incredible place. I really loved it. You saw all the way back to Canaanite foundations through Judges era, Israelite. You saw Assyrian occupation, I do have, if you want to check it out on YouTube, I do have the Megiddo horse stables on there. And I was blessed to go to Israel with my son Luke, who is 16. And when we were walking around the horse stables, they're only about maybe 100 feet long by maybe 30 feet wide. And he looks around and he says, they're supposed to have 450, 430 horses in here. He says, that's an awful lot of carbon. I wouldn't want to work in here. So, but it was just beautiful. They've done, if you've been to Megiddo years ago, they've really done a lot to improve the excavations and to keep the site up. So that was beautiful. From there, we went to, let's see, where did we go after Megiddo? Oh, we went to Mount Erbal, which was a Jewish fortress. I'm not exactly sure when it started, but I think it was maybe 3rd or 4th century BCE. And then they had an ancient synagogue there that was decimated by the Romans. Oh, fantastic, Stephen. Awesome. That there is just this incredible cliff. It's like this, almost like, not like the Grand Canyon, but it's a division where you have two plates that come together. And you have this valley that comes down between them that's just beautiful. But the way that history records it, the group of Jews that lived there who would not submit to the Romans, I believe they escaped into a cave, and the Romans came and they basically burnt or smoked them out of the cave, and or smoked them or burned them to death within that cave. So we visited that site. That was beautiful. That night we stayed in Tiberias, and I will say, no, it is not Mount Ebal. Mount Ebal is much further south near Shechem, and it is not a place. It is Palestinian. Yeah, Mount Ebal. Yes, hard to tell with my southern dialect. Yes, Shechem is not a safe place to go, so we could not go there, unfortunately, because it is under hostile Palestinian control right now. But we did go to, let's see, that night we went to Galilee Green, which is a kibbutz that produces olive oil. They are friends on Facebook. You can see, yes, the big cliff beside Kinnereth. It's absolutely beautiful. It's just gorgeous. But we went there, we sampled some of their products, and let me tell you, the dates that you get in the store are not the same dates that you get in Israel, because in Israel they're fresh and they're big and they're juicy and meaty. So when you get these dried dates, they're really kind of sad when you compare them, because they don't have near the meat or the moisture content, and that's probably just to enable them to ship them and for storage. So you have to take some of that moisture out. But that was beautiful. We sampled probably about 10 different types of olive oil. They showed us through their olive making process there, and that was very nice. At night, because we were on, I believe the entire time we stayed on the eastern side of Kinnereth. And at night, you could hear Russia bombing the rebels. So you'd hear these big explosions. So I didn't tell anybody that until we came home, because we didn't want people to worry. But you could hear that. The next day out, and this, I believe, was Wednesday, we went up north. And our goal, one of the places we wanted to see, was Nimrod's Castle. And if you're not familiar with Nimrod's Castle, I encourage each of you to go online and just look at it, because there's pictures of it. Nimrod's Castle dates to the 12th century AD, and it was a Crusader castle. I had no idea that the Crusaders built a castle in the Golan Heights, but that's where it was. And it was beautiful. So to get there, however, we had to go through the territory that Israel gained in 1967. So we drove through Syrian bunkers. We walked inside of the Syrian headquarters there in the Golan. that had been bombed out, and you saw on the side walls it was just riddled with bullet holes. But it was very interesting. There was a quote stenciled in Hebrew on the walls of these headquarters of Isaiah 60. I think it's Isaiah 62, 66 verse 2, where it says, "To whom will Yahweh look?" And the implication is that he will look to him, with a clean heart, with pure intentions. And so that was very moving. And while we were there, we actually had people that were doing, military type people doing some sort of surveillance that were meeting in the Syrian headquarters just 100 feet away from the Syrian border. So that was kind of neat. Everybody was kind of sticking close together with that one. We went further north to the actual border, and Israel at their northern border has erected a chain link fence, a high security chain link fence. It keeps out more than just the dog. This fence has been very effective. No Syrian refugees have tried to cross their border, and they don't have that type of border problem. We felt very safe there. We saw the UN headquarters, which at one point in time had, I think he said it was about 15,000 people working there. And right now, I think they're down to about maybe 500 people because the UN has totally pulled out of that border at this point in time. From there, we tried to go to Nimrod's castle. We could not get in on that day because there were very high winds. And Nimrod's castle is just on this precipice on top of this huge mountainous hill. And for a tour bus, because we were with a tour bus and about 45 people, the winds just were not safe. So they had actually closed the entire exhibition, afraid people might get blown off of the fortress or something. So we went down into the Golan and we visited a Syrian bunker. And this was one of the Syrian bunkers that was bombed out during the 67 war. If I remember right, all the Syrians were killed there except for 3. There were 3 survivors. So we went through some of their battle works. We went through some of their trenches. Very, very interesting to see what a Syrian trench looks like. And as we were walking, now let me say, when you leave Tiberias and you start heading north, this is really still an active front for Israel. And because of it, both Syria and Israel have planted landmines everywhere. So you have fences on either side of the road, but there's huge signs in bright yellow signs with red, caution markers that say caution landmines. It's my understanding the Israelis mark their landmines. They know right where they are. The Syrians do not. They just blanket the area. But if they know where those landmines are, they certainly do not tell. And according to our tour guide who had served in the IDF, he said that the Syrians don't even know where those landmines are. But Israel does leave those landmines there because there is still the possibility that either Syria, the rebels, or ISIS could one day invade along that border again. So they do keep those landmines there. So when we went into the Syrian bunker, you had 2 rows of fence. There was like a tourist path into them, but 6 inches off that path, you had 2 rows of like cattle fencing where it says do not walk landmines. So you had live active landmines very, very close to where the public would drive, and throughout the north there's just landmines everywhere. So anyways, as we came out of the Syrian bunker, we headed to Hetzor, and that for me was just an incredible experience. If you've read I'd gotten as far as chapter 13 in my book, I talk extensively about Hetzor and how important Hetzor is to understanding the Exodus and Judges era, because the common view among scholarship is that they want to what's called telescope both Joshua's campaign in Judges with that of Deborah's campaign in Judges 5. And they want to telescope it into one event, whereas I propose they are separated by 250 years. And when you see the layers of building layers and the destruction layers, you realize that it happened at different time periods, and seeing that firsthand was just such an incredible experience. And to see the countryside surrounding it, to be on the eastern side of Hetzor, you could see an army coming probably a day and a half away. You just had incredible visibility. Even from the north, you had a lot of visibility. Your vulnerable side really would have been more on your west, and because you had hills that kind of obscured. But seeing that was just amazing. And the other thing that really, Stephen says, the highway bypasses it now, but the first time I was there, we drove right through Hetzor. Awesome. That is wonderful. I got a lot of pictures, because it's really hard to find some of the pictures, especially the ones that I wanted to use of the site for writings that I may do in the future. But I wanted to, this was an observation, and not just of Hetzor, but of almost every site that I saw. Anytime somebody tells you that there is not evidence to support Scripture or the stories in Scripture, they are really overstating and just really being, what's the word I'm looking for? Because I'm wanting to pick a kind term. They are really making a false case and a very false premise. And the pictures are coming, Stephen. Some of them are on my Facebook page, but I have a whole lot more coming that I'll be uploading over the weekend. Hetzor, which has been excavated now for 40 years, I would venture that of these 40 years of excavations, only 3%, at the most, if you're going to be very generous, 8% of Hetzor itself has been excavated. Everything that we've learned from excavations throughout the Holy Land, not one excavation contradicts anything written in Scripture. In fact, everything that is unearthed always upholds Scripture and confirms it in some way. One of the arguments against the validity of Scripture on the account of Deborah is the fact that we have not unearthed any of the chariots. Hi, Billy. Oh, I'm so glad you're here. Billy was with us on this tour, and he was phenomenal. And I've got to just brag on Billy here for a minute. Billy is 81, and you would think he was 40. He kept up with us. I mean, he was such a joy and a delight, just going everywhere and doing everything. And you could just tell how much the trip meant to him. And yes, and we had incredible tour guides with Shuki, as well as Tovia and Ross and Jono. It was just an incredible experience. But coming back to Hazor for a minute, when you hear criticisms of the text, and they say there is no evidence for chariots at Hetzor or other places, you just need to look at them like they're crazy, because the only places at Hetzor that are excavated are living and dwelling places. You wouldn't put a chariot inside your living room. That's not where you're going to keep it. You're going to keep your chariots at the base of your fortifications to protect your fortifications. So that is an area that has yet to be excavated. We don't know what is another 10, 15 feet underneath the ground, unexcavated ground. So I think that you really have to take all of those views with a grain of salt, because so little has been excavated. And you could see on the opposing hill, on both sides of Hetzor, you could see where there were building structures where there at one point in time had been life, and who knows what it dates to because it's unexcavated. So that is another context, and who knows what they may find 200 years down the road if they're able to excavate there. So yes, it's hard to believe that Billy's over 70. He looks like a young whippersnapper. I'd say 68. But he was such a joy and a delight throughout the entire trip. And I think one of his favorite moments I'm going to share with you too, if I have this right, Billy. So after Hatzor, we headed south, and I think at the end of that day we went to the tomb of Maimonides there in Tiberias, and then the next morning we got up and we headed south. And I think one of the first places that we hit was Bet Shean, and that was so much fun. Whether you had the Byzantine era remains, you had the Greek and Roman era remains, and then of course I went up to the Citadel and we saw the remains from Egyptian occupation, which is very important with this, with the story of Deborah, because Bet Shean would have been very influential during her time. You also have Solomon had a fortress there. But the one thing that I was always interested in each of these sites was where was their water source. So me and a couple from Canada who I just fell in love with, we took and we shimmied down the side of the little tell there to this beautiful oasis. You know, here you have all this parched land, and there's this beautiful stream of running water that runs right next to the tell. So that is why they were able to live there and to build there. And it was just amazing. 19 layers. Yes, yes. I have to research that. I'm not exactly sure how many occupation layers there are. I know it goes back to Canaanite times. And from the point of Thutmose III, Egypt had a very strong presence there. Egypt also had a scribal school located there where they would train not only their own scribes, but they would bring in hostages of the leaders and chieftains of the surrounding territories, probably many Israelites. They would train them formally in the Egyptian schools and then return them back either to their own provinces or to other provinces to be loyal administrators for the Egyptian crown. So that was very fascinating to see. My son found a 3,000-year-old petrified olive within the foundation of the Egyptian fortress that is there. So he thought that was very interesting. Stephen says, later called Scythopolis because some Scythians, formerly Israelites living on the steeps, came back briefly during Josiah's reforms. Right, and you also have just a little bit more history about Shean. It is in the valley around Bet Shean where Saul and his sons were killed. So it has a lot of rich and meaningful history for Israel, and it is in the north, closer to the Galilee. So that was just, I really loved the time that we had there. And it was so funny because I think on every place where we visited like a really, historical site, I think I was the last one in the bus because I was getting all my pictures, which you guys will see in my video, and just totally enjoying the experience. Yes, the bodies were hung on the wall, and then the Gibeonites, I believe, came and helped rescue them and took the shame of their bodies and buried them. So then from Bet Shean, we headed south, and I'm trying to think if this was the same day. I'm not exactly sure. Let me see here. Let me go, because I posted the itinerary on Facebook. So let me go back over here real quick. Bear with me, because I want to get this right here. So we did have the privilege of going to Engedi, and that was, oh my goodness, I did not expect um, En Gedi. That was just such a blessing and such a joy and a delight. You know, when you walk up, first of all, let me tell you what En Gedi is. En Gedi is one of the places where, you know, when Saul was chasing David throughout the countryside, it was one of the places that David hid, and Saul had come, spent the night in the cave, and, you know, David cut his garment in the morning and, you know, called out to Saul. But what, okay, I have this now. So, okay, so yeah, day 3 has, oh, let me, hold on. Before we go into En Gedi too much, let me go back to the previous day. We also did Tel Dan, but it was closed because of the high winds and storms had made a lot of the trees at Tel Dan fall, so we couldn't actually get into the site, which we were really sad about. But then going day 4, we went Bet Shan. We briefly visited the Jordan River where a lot of people were getting baptized. We went by Qumran. We did not, we ate it up at the cafeteria at the base, but we did not visit the ruins or the remains, which were kind of sad because we were right there and we really didn't have time to enjoy them. But we did go to En Gedi, and En Gedi was just amazing because, again, it's not only the uh, the place where David and Saul, you know, met and confronted each other, and Saul temporarily repented from chasing after David, but it's this beautiful place. And you know, there's so much missing from the biblical story when you don't see it, because as a kid, you know, I always envisioned these hills with caves in them, and he was hiding in a hill with a cave. Had no idea that it was a water cave, a cave filled with water, and that there were 2 caves. You know, you had the lower cave and the upper cave. That's if this is the historical site, which it is possible. When you look as you drive down to the Dead Sea, there, you know, from the West Bank down along the Jordan River, you find that there are so many hundreds of places where there are dried up waterfalls. So we don't know, maybe one of those places could have been the spot as well. But this is the one that's commonly recognized. From there, we did go to the Dead Sea, and we had a wonderful evening at the Dead Sea. We stayed at the Hotel David, which is a 5-star hotel. It was just beautiful. It was absolutely incredible. From there, we spent a little bit of time at the Dead Sea the next day. Some of us took an early morning out. I think we left at 7:30, and we hiked up Masada. And then we got to see Herod's remains, of the remains of his castle. We spent quite a bit of time there, and then later we were Shuki, our guide, as well as Tovia, joined up with us, and, you know, it was just a wonderful time. Wonderful time with that. Then we headed, this was Friday, so we headed back to Jerusalem, and we got to Jerusalem very, very early. I think it was maybe around 3 o'clock. Yes, we went on the snake trail and thoroughly enjoyed it. My son Luke, from the bottom to the top, made it in 15 minutes. The rest of us, it was closer to an hour. So, and I think this, correct me if I'm wrong, Billy, but I think this was his favorite spot. And if you don't mind me sharing, um, I guess Billy had been afraid of heights, and he went on the cable car up to Masada, and he did it. I mean, we were all so proud of him, because I think it appeared that he just had such a wonderful and thrilling experience. Really, really enjoyed it. It was great to have him up there on the top of that fortress with the rest of us. It was just very, very meaningful. So from there, of course, we did go back to Jerusalem, and we were in Jerusalem for 5 days. We stayed at the Prima King's Hotel. And from there, we went around, let me see what our itinerary was here real quick. We, let's see, we went to the Oh, that Friday night we did go to the tomb of Rachel, which is interesting because it's near Bethlehem. And, Bethlehem is no longer, even though it's a Christian site, a Jewish site, Israelite site, it's within the authority of the Palestinians. So when you go in, there's this checkpoint you have to go through. Of course, you have checkpoints everywhere. Anytime there's a major intersection or anything that leads to the West Bank, you're always going to have security checkpoints. But here at Rachel's tomb, not only did you have security checkpoints, but when you go in this little, I don't know, maybe 400 or 500 foot corridor, you have cement walls that are 30 feet high to protect you. So you go in there, there's Rachel's tomb, people pray or whatever there. But while we were there, it was obviously there was some sort of domestic altercation on the other side of the wall, because we heard a couple very loud, whether it was tear gas explosions or grenades, we don't know. I don't know. But it was very loud explosions, I guess, aimed at calming the populace over there. So anyways, from Rachel's tomb, we came back to Jerusalem, and then the next day, we, let's see, the next day, we went to the Kotel and walked around the old city. On Sunday, we had the Temple Mount Dig project, which was fascinating because we got to sift through some of the temple remains. My son found a brass hook from, I believe it was the 1600s. He found this little brass ring. Tovia found a Jewish coin. No, I believe it was a Byzantine coin that dated roughly 500 AD. So that was amazing. From there, we went to the Israeli Museum, which was a wonderful experience. I definitely could have spent a whole lot more time there. And then Monday, oh my goodness, Monday was so incredible because we went to Shiloh. And that was so beautiful to be at the place where the ark, had first been housed, where the tabernacle was. It was just, oh, your twos, Billy. Yes, there was just something special about Shiloh. I can't put my finger on it, but it was so special. And I don't know if you know this, Billy, but when I was at one of the shops in Jerusalem, they sold these maps of the Holy Land, and he was showing me an enhanced satellite image that had been blown up. And in scripture, when it says that YHWH put his name on Shiloh, I don't think we really know what that means, because the satellite image reveals the name Yod-Hey. So the name of Yah, when you look at the satellite image of those mountains, that where Shiloh actually is, the mountains and the ridges form the name of the Creator. So God actually really did put his name on that particular place. When you go to Jerusalem, the mountains, hills, and ridges once again form the name of YHWH, Yod-Hey. There in Jerusalem is a little bit difficult to see, but it is there. So I found that very, very interesting. But yeah, there was just something sweet and so special about Shiloh that, it was almost as though we were returning. And it was just very, very special. I really could have spent, I could have spent all day there, I think. From there we just drove to the top of the Mount of Olives, and we took pictures of Jerusalem. As you all may know, the Mount of Olives is within Palestinian territory, and you have to be very, very careful because some days they're peaceful, other days they're not so peaceful, and they're all stirred up, and you don't go over there. And then I didn't even know it, but there's 2 levels. We were at the lower observation deck because the upper observation deck is not so nice. So you don't go up there unless you are Muslim. So anyway, so we had that, and then we came back to Jerusalem, And the next day we did the City of David, we did Hezekiah's Tunnel, we did the Davidson Center, Temple Mount Institute, and the Kotel Tunnel Tour, which was a lot of fun. And we also, it was so funny because we also went up on the Temple Mount Tuesday morning. You never know if you're going to get in or not because they only allow, since the WAF had been in charge, they only allow people to come up there from about for 2 hours in the morning, and that's it. And it had been raining off and on now for probably about 8 days. It was a little cool, and all morning long it had rained. And let me tell you this too. I missed a fun part of the story. So the morning we went to Shiloh on Monday morning, raining cats and dogs everywhere, kind of chilly cold. So we had to duck into the visitors center. And finally the rain let up just enough, and it got a little bit less and a little bit less. I want to tell you, the moment we all stepped onto that place where the tabernacle was supposed to have resided, the rain stopped. And it was as though the clouds rolled away and there was sunshine. It was amazing. The same thing happened the next day when we went to the Temple Mount. Raining all evening long, all night long, and cats and dogs. And then it let up a little bit, probably around maybe 6:30 or 7. And we left, I believe it was right at 7:30. We went to the hotel, we got in line, and the moment we stepped up on the Temple Mount, the rain stopped. I'm not kidding you, because it rained the whole, when you're in that little tunnel, you know, going that little wooden tunnel that you'll see in pictures, going up, it was still raining, still dreary and everything else. The moment our group stepped on the Temple Mount, the rain stopped and the sun came out. It was just, we very much appreciated that. And we had a fun time up there. It appears that we had our own little security detail that followed us around. And then we were witnessed to by a Muslim on the Temple Mount. And the way that he was describing Muhammad and Islam, you would have thought he was describing Jesus Christ. It was just ironic. And knowing what I do about the Quran, I was like going, okay, this is not the view of Muhammad that I've ever heard anyone, you know, teach or even the Quran embrace. That was a little interesting. Stephen says, didn't they actually build a low wall around the tabernacle at Shiloh? Yes, they did. You see that low wall there at the highest point, right at the precipice of the tell on the edge. And the other thing that he said that they've discovered in satellite images is that there is this fence that is underground. It only shows up on satellite images at Shiloh, where you have a fence on the surrounding hills around Shiloh. And what they discovered is that as long as you're below this line, you could have seen the tabernacle. The moment you crossed this little fence, you didn't see the you couldn't see the tabernacle. So the idea was that when Israel came and they worshiped there 3 times a year, they would have stayed below this line in their tents. And that way they could see, you know, when it's time to, I guess, congregate and different things like that. But I found that quite interesting, especially given the early part of Israel's history and when it would have occurred. So then from, you know, again, we did do the City of David. We went Hezekiah's Tunnel. We went down into the Canaanite fortress. I posted information about the Canaanite fortress earlier today on my Facebook page if you guys are interested in seeing any more of that. But that was very, very fascinating. And to see, because there actually was a Canaanite waterway long before David and his men were there. But again, the this area, Jerusalem was important because it had water, and it's really the only place in the area that had its own water source. The last day for the group was day 10. That was a Wednesday. We went and walked the ramparts. This was Ross's idea. We walked along the city wall around parts of Jerusalem, and that was a lot of fun. We also did Zedekiah's cave, and that was really finished up the group tour. Now, I stayed 2 extra days, and we did a few other things, walked around Jerusalem. We went to a First Temple Museum, which was very rustic. I think it's going to take a very willing philanthropist to invest in it to kind of bring it up to snuff, but it was cute. And we just had a lot of fun walking around Jerusalem and spending time with friends. And it was just such an incredible, blessed experience. I'm just so glad that we went. I'm so glad Billy went, and everybody there. And this tour was just, we kind of all came from different walks. I believe at least 60% of the people on the tour are converting to Orthodox Judaism. There were some of us, I would say, Ephraimite people who are very happy with sticking with the Tanakh and staying there. And we just had such a wonderful time with everyone, such incredible fellowship and unity. And there was just, you get to know people, and it's such a joy and a delight. So if you guys ever have time, I highly recommend the tour with Jono, and I don't think you'll be disappointed. It was, again, such a rich and wonderful experience. So that was my trip to Israel in 2015 with Jono's Tanakh tour. And Billy, did you have any other comments or ideas to share from your experience with Israel? So anyways, I am still suffering a little bit from jet lag. I've been going to bed every day around between 8 and 9. This is the longest that I have stayed up, 10:15 now, since I have been home. Steven says, here are my video protections from past 3 tours. Oh, fantastic. You know what? I don't think you can post it on chat because it's blocked. It's something that Google does, but post it on Facebook because I would be very interested in seeing those. The videos that I'm posting are very raw. They're uncut. They're just take it as you see it, and I'm posting it that way. But I would be very interested in seeing your videos. So if you can post that on Facebook or send me a link, that would be great. Okay, yeah, YouTube blocks it. So unless it's a YouTube link, I believe they only allow YouTube or direct Google links, something that they themselves verify. So, all right. Well, it has been a wonderful evening. I look forward to seeing you guys tomorrow morning at Roots of Faith. 10:30 Central. Ross is back in town. I think y'all went 3 weeks without him, and look forward to seeing you guys and talking with you guys and chatting tomorrow. So just keeping the fellowship going. So have a wonderful evening. Shabbat Shalom. And thank you guys for coming. This is always so much fun. I love it when you guys make comments, and it's almost as though we're talking together. So, all right. Shabbat Shalom. I'm going to go ahead and close the room.